Most people will have no idea what Edessa is and why it should be connected to, the gospel story. And then we can go back into how we got to Edessa via Queen Cleopatra. And
All right. Well, Ralph, it is amazing to have you back today. Your last video was extremely popular. I think it's up to about 1,000 views now. So people are really hungry for this information, and it's only been about a week or so. And you're back again today, and we are discussing the story of Edessa.
yes, going into the New Testament, we explored the Old Testament and we saw how we could put a lot of it back into Egypt, and how a lot of these characters were actually important people within Egypt. They were kings, queens, and pharaohs. And we can continue that over into the New Testament. People will probably not know about Edessa because it's largely been deleted from history. I wrote several books on the New Testament, and I had never heard about Edessa, which is odd because it's a central location for the gospel story. In fact, the book I've written on Edessa, which is called Jesus, King of Edessa, was not called that when I first started it. So on my computer, it's still called Queen Helena, because it was supposed to be a book about Queen Helena, because I had never heard of Edessa and its importance. But as I went through that book and I got about halfway through the life of Queen Helena, I suddenly found this place called Edessa, and it suddenly became very central to the story. So where is Edessa? Well, it's north, used to be in northern Syria. It's now in Anatolia. So it's north of Aleppo. It's beyond the Euphrates as we look at it. So it's east of the Euphrates. And in modern maps, it will be called Sanlurfa, but traditionally it was always known as Edessa. And it's very central to this story. But it's been deleted from history because lots of people didn't want you to know about it. And that cover up it's been very effective, and it's even more effective now than it was during the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, people knew about Edessa. For instance, Alfred the Great, who was one of the great kings of what became England, when he wasn't battling against the Saxons, he sent an ambassador to Edessa and to India to give tribute to those regions and to the Edessan church in India, which we will talk about. So here's a king from the 9th century in England sending ambassadors to Edessa and to Malabar in India, where the Edessan church was in India. So people did know about this place, but it's been lost from history. Lost from history after the Knights Templar, I would say, because a lot of their secrets disappeared at that time. You need to know a couple of things about this. One is that the gospel story is about the Jewish revolt. So everything is 40 years later than the traditional timeline of the Gospels. This is what I call the chronological chasm. Traditional timeline is that Jesus was crucified in about AD 30. In reality, he was crucified in AD 70 after the Jewish revolt, and we have a verbatim story of that from Josephus Flavius, which we will go into. So the timeline is 40 years later, and the central location that this was all about was actually Edessa and Jerusalem, because these were the kings of Jerusalem as well as the kings of Edessa. There was a royal family in Edessa who was very influential, and they became the monarchy of Judea. We shall go into Queen Helena later. She became the queen of the Jews in AD 50. So what I want to do initially is to explain the reasons why I think this has happened. And so I've got two little bits here to start off with. The first one is the parable of the vineyard owner. So this comes from the Gospels. Matthew 21:33 is a good example of this one. So parable of the vineyard owner. It says that there was a lord a very important man, obviously, who planted a vineyard and let it out to a tenant, and he went away to a far country. And when the harvest drew near, he sent his servants and the tenants to the tenant who was on that land, that he might receive his rent. But the tenant took his servants, and he beat one and killed another. So the Lord, therefore, of the vineyard, when he comes, what will he do to these tenants? He will miserably destroy those wicked men and let out his vineyard to another tenant who will pay their rent. Okay, so this is a parable from Jesus. This is Jesus speaking. So why is Jesus defending the rights of absentee landlords to kill their tenants if they don't pay their rent on time? Where is the man of the people Jesus in this story? What's it talking about? Why is this in, a saying from the mouth of Jesus? Well, you have to know the underlying politics of this region when this was all happening. And as I say, this wasn't happening in the AD 20s, this was happening in the AD 60s during the lead up to the Jewish revolt. And the Jewish revolt started in AD 66 and it ended in AD 70. This is what this story was talking about. So to understand this parable, all we need to do is swap the landowner, the Lord, as it says here, for the kings of Edessa. We will talk about Edessa later. Edessa, as I say, is in northern Syria. So the Lord is the kings of Edessa, and the tenant is the Romans, because the Romans were on their land. They considered this to be their land, Syria and Judea. So let's read that again, that little parable. What it was actually trying to say is there was an Edessan king who had lands in Judea, the vineyard, and he let it out to the Romans and went away to a far country. They went back to Edessa in northern Syria. And when the harvest drew near, he sent his servants to the Romans that he might receive his rent, his tribute for the Romans being on his land. But the Romans took his servants and beat one and killed another. So when the Edessan king of these lands comes, what will he do to these Romans? He will miserably destroy these wicked Romans and let out his lands to another tenant who will pay their rent on time. This is what this story was about. It was a tax dispute because the Edessans had been given their lands tax-free. So they shouldn't have to pay tribute to Rome. In fact, they were saying that Rome should pay tribute to the Edessans because they were on their lands. So this was a call to war. This was not a message of peace from the pauper Prince of Peace that we understand Jesus to be in the gospel story. This was a call to war against the Romans. They're on our lands. They're not paying rent. In fact, they're demanding rent from us because the Romans wanted tribute, and therefore we should go to war with them. And that war was known as the Jewish Revolt. That's what the Jewish Revolt was all about. It was a tax dispute. So that sets the story, and it sort of rather changes the gospel story somewhat. Now we have a real secular story about a tax dispute with Rome. Whereas normally if you go to church, they will minimize the role of Rome in this story, and they will pretend it's a Jewish story in Judea, and the Romans just happened to be standing there on the sidelines somewhere. But no, they were central to this story. And also the story was central to Edessa. And we can find that from the death of John the Baptist. And that links us straight back to Edessa. But again, you won't know that because this is not taught within Sunday school, or even if you go through theology, they won't teach you this. But it's quite obvious. All you need to do is amalgamate a couple of different chroniclers, Josephus Flavius and Moses of Corine. The death of John the Baptist doesn't just appear in the gospel story, it's also in real history. So we sort of know that John the Baptist is a real person, which sort of undermines the people who say that this is pure mythology. Because we have these two camps. We have the literalists who say, well, we've got this Bible, therefore you've got to believe it. And then we have the mythicists who say that we can't find any of this story in the historical record, therefore it is all fiction and none of it is true. Well, I'm sort of treading a median path between these two and saying, hold on a minute, these events, some of these events do appear in real history, and therefore this is quite possibly real history. It's just you don't know what it's talking about, especially as they have moved the timeline by 40 years, and therefore you're not going to find any of it. But anyway, the death of John the Baptist is mentioned by Josephus Flavius, who is Judaism's greatest historian. He was a first century historian who wrote everything that happened in the first century. And he writes about John the Baptist, and this appears to be a true piece of history. It's not an interpolation. It's not been thrown in afterwards. So what happened with John the Baptist? This was a royal dispute. All of this story is all about royal characters. So Tetrarch Antipas, he was like the king of Galilee, one of the sons of Herod the Great, of course. Herod Antipas divorced his wife, Pharsalus, who was the daughter of the king Aretas of Petra. Petra being the rose-red city down in Jordan. So he was married to Pharsalus, and he divorced her and sent her back home again. And he married Herodias instead, who was the wife or the former wife of Herod Philip. Philip was his brother or his half-brother. And so he took Philip's wife. Now, John the Baptist said that this marriage was illegal. Firstly, you're not supposed to marry your dead brother's wife. And secondly, Herodias was his niece or his half-niece. So they were very closely related. And so John the Baptist said that this marriage was illegal. And this is basically what it says in the gospel story as well. And so Salome, who was the daughter of Herodias, asked for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And that is the famous story, the beheading of John the Baptist. But we get this same story in real history. Josephus Flavius, gives us this story. And he says that King Aretas had an argument with Herod Antipas. So they raised armies and prepared for war. And Herod Antipas was upset by this because his daughter had been sent home. And when they had joined battle, all of Herod's army was destroyed by the treachery of some fugitives who, although they were from the lands of Herod Philip, they joined with Aretas's army. So Aretas, the king of Petra, was helped by some fugitives who Josephus doesn't name, in his battle against Herod Antipas. Now, you know something is wrong here because Josephus knows everything in first century Judea, and he's not telling us who these people were. It's quite obvious that he's withholding some facts here, which he always does. We can find the truth if we go to Moses of Corinne, who's a Syriac, Armenian historian from the 6th century, who gives us exactly the same story, but with a Syriac Armenian slant to it. Because remember that the Eastern Church had been separated from the Western Church for hundreds of years by this time, hidden behind the Council of Chalcedon and the Iron Curtain of Islam. So the two churches were very different and they had different traditions. And Moses of Corinne was an Armenian, and he considered Edessa to be part of his kingdom. And so he wasn't under any restrictions that the church in the West, the Roman church, were imposing upon this story. So anyway, he gives us the same story with some slightly different twists to it. So he says, King Abgar, now there's a new name for you, He's the king of Edessa.
Mm-hmm.
King Abgar, having returned to his city of Edessa, allied himself with King Aretas of Petra and gave him some auxiliary troops to make war upon Herod Antipas. Being sharply attacked, Herod's troops were defeated thanks to the help of the brave Edessans. As if by divine providence, vengeance was taken for the death of John the Baptist. Okay, same story, but now we know who these fugitives, remember Josephus called these auxiliary troops fugitives. Now we know that this was the army of Edessa because Moses of Corine tells us so. Okay, we can learn several things from this. We can learn that Edessa has been deleted from the works of Josephus completely. You can go to an electronic version of the works of Josephus. You can type in Edessa. You can type in Abgar or Abgarus, who was the king of Edessa, and it'll just say nothing found. It's been deleted from history. It's been deleted by Josephus, and then it was later deleted by the Catholic Church as well, because they didn't want any mention of it. It's been deleted from history. Nobody knows anything about Edessa or the Edessan monarchy. But here we see that the Edessan monarchy was intimately involved in this dispute that ended with the beheading of John the Baptist. Now, why were they there? Well, we know why King Aretas of Petra was there, because his daughter had been spurned and sent back home again. So that's why he was there. But why were the Edessans from northern Syria down in Judea fighting against Herod Antipas? Well, the only other thing that happened at this time was the death of John the Baptist. And the second quote I gave you there from Moses of Corine says, it was divine providence. Vengeance was taken for the death of John the Baptist. So this battle was divine vengeance for his death. It directly implies that John the Baptist was related to the Edessan royal family. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been down in Judea getting all upset and fighting against the Judean king. That was Herod Antipas. Yeah, so now we see that Edessa was central to this story. John the Baptist was related to this royal family. And so the entire gospel story has to be something to do with Edessa. Interesting, isn't it? And this comes from Acts 11:28, so listeners can look it up if they want. And it's about a famine, and it says a person named Agabus prophesied that there would be a great famine throughout the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. We think this is AD 48 or AD 51, something like that. The disciples, so we're talking about the disciples of Jesus here, determined to send famine relief to the brothers in Judea, and they sent it by the hands of Saul and Barnabas. Now, if you just skip over that verse, it doesn't really mean very much. It's not very central to this story. But hold on a minute. This famine was very famous. We have mention of it from many other secular authors. And the famine relief was given by Queen Helena of the Adiabeni. Again, it's another location that listeners won't have heard about. Adiabeni was supposed to be even further down in Iraq. It's modern Erbil, which is near Mosul in Iraq, supposedly. I don't think it was actually. I think Adiabeni is a made-up name by Josephus Flavius. But anyway, there was a famous queen there called Queen Helena. She was the one who gave the famine relief to Judea at this very time. So where's the link here? Well, in the gospel story, it says that the person who was involved in this famine relief was Agabus. A lot of people, myself included, think that Agabus is a hyperchorism, a nickname for King Abgarus of Edessa. They've changed the name because Agabus means locust, and they always do this. We'll talk about this in a minute if we remember. So they're making fun out of his name. They're calling him a locust. Now the link here is that the Syriac historians say that Queen Helena was married to King Abgarus of Edessa. So the famine relief was given by Queen Helena, who was married to King Abgarus, who was the king of Edessa. And so when it's in Acts 11:28, when it's talking about Agabus giving this famine relief money, it's the same story. It's the Queen Helena story, giving famine relief money to the people in Judea, in Jerusalem. Now, the interesting thing from this that we can take home from this, that Edessa has been deleted from the gospel story, because you'd never know that this is a story about Edessa. The famine relief money was taken by Saul and Barnabas. Now, Saul is the guy who wrote most of the New Testament, and Saul was an ambassador of the Edessan royal family. You see how closely connected the gospel story is to the kings of Edessa.
Mm-hmm.
Saul, who wrote most of the New Testament, was an ambassador. He was part of that royal family himself. He was related to that royal family. That's how close this story gets to Edessa, which has been deleted from history. We've got another one here while we're on this subject of the links with Edessa. This same guy, Saul, and that they love to do this in these stories, he was called a tent maker. That comes from Acts 18:3, if people want to look it up. So he's called a tent maker, and you think, hold on a minute. Saul was very important. A, we've just seen he's an ambassador of Edessa. B, when he was thrown into prison, we'll come on to this in a minute. He was thrown into prison for a number of years for teachings that went against Judaism. But when he was in jail, he was visited by two of the governors of Judea, went to see him, one of which was wanting a bribe from him. And then he was visited by the king and queen of Judea, by Agrippa II and Berenike. A tent maker in a prison does not get visited by the king and queen of Judea. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And, you know, even if you did, you wouldn't ask a tent maker for a bribe, because to get out of prison, basically, a tent maker won't be able to afford anything. So we know that this Saul character, the guy who wrote most of the New Testament, was very important. Otherwise, the king and queen would not have come to prison to go and see him. And yet the Gospels call him a tent maker. It's pretty obvious, and nobody else has ever said this before, I'm pretty sure, because I've not seen this written anywhere before, that he wasn't a tent maker, he was a Sukkot maker. And a Sukkot is a tent for the festival of Sukkot in Judaism. And the festival of Sukkot is the festival where they make tents because they're making imitations of the tabernacle from the Exodus. And so they all make these tents, and they go and stay in these tents for a couple of days, once a year, as a celebration of the Exodus. And it just so happens that Queen Helena of Adiabeni Edessa, this same Queen Helena we've just spoken about, she was famed for having the biggest Sukkot in the whole of Judaism. And who made it? Well, it's quite obvious that Saul made it, because he was an ambassador. He was related to this royal family. That's why he was known as a tent maker. Nothing to do with tents. It was a Sukkot. Changes the story somewhat, doesn't it? We now have a story about powerful people and momentous events in Judea, because it was the Edessan royal family who started the Jewish revolt. And we'll come on to that perhaps in a minute. So this was a story about the Jewish revolt and this battle between Rome and this very important royal family up in Edessa. So where did this royal family come from? I think they were newcomers to this land, and they were very well connected. We go back to Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. When Julius Caesar was murdered which was, when was that? 44 BC, 43 BC. Cleopatra was in Rome as his sort of de facto wife. They weren't officially married. Julius Caesar gets murdered, and Cleopatra runs immediately back to Egypt because her life is in danger.
And she's pregnant at the time, is she not?
Yes, so Cicero says she's pregnant.
Yeah.
And he writes this letter saying that he hopes, because another lady had had a miscarriage at that time, and he hopes that Cleopatra will have a miscarriage because he doesn't want a scion of Caesar to become the next emperor of Rome. A scion being an heir, but not only an heir of Caesar, but an heir of Egypt. He didn't want an Egyptian prince becoming the next emperor of Rome, although they didn't have emperors at that stage, I suppose. But anyway, a de facto emperor of Rome. So Cicero is very concerned about this, but later on he writes another letter, and the crisis has passed. And there are only two reasons why that will be happen. Perhaps Cleopatra did have a miscarriage, or perhaps the child was a daughter, because a daughter could not become emperor of Rome. And I think that's what happens. So we have this lost daughter of Cleopatra, because Cleopatra had several children. She had Caesarion, who we don't know what happened to. Funnily enough, Caesar never acknowledged Caesarion as being his son, which is a bit peculiar. So there's been lots of speculation over that. Then she had another two children with Mark Antony as well, Cleopatra Selene and Helios. So Selene and Helios, the sun and the moon. So where did we get to? So yeah, Cleopatra has run off back to Egypt, and she has a daughter, a lost daughter, who wasn't of much use to Cleopatra because this daughter would not service her needs to take over Rome. And then we move on by about 20 years to the time of Augustus. And so Augustus is now emperor, and he's sorting out his borders because Rome had just been, in the midst of a civil war. And so he goes to Yuba II, who is the king of Mauritania, which is North Africa, a client king of Rome, of course. This is a Roman land, but run by a client king, just as Judea was run by a client king by Herod. And so he gives Yuba II the daughter of Cleopatra, Cleopatra Selene. So he did quite well. He got a daughter of Cleopatra who was an incarnation of Isis. And and they became very successful. So this is the tomb of Cleopatra Selene, the daughter of Cleopatra, which is over in Libya at present. So not many people go to visit it. And it's quite huge. It's this enormous great drum with a conical pyramid on the top of it. A little bit worse for the wear because someone has made a hole in it trying to look for the tomb. But as far as I know, they never did find the tomb. The whereabouts of Yuba II and Cleopatra is still unknown. I suppose it might be down the bottom somewhere buried in the ground. But anyway, I don't think it's ever been found.
Was she a twin as well, Selene?
Yeah, she was the twin of Helios, so
Yeah.
a boy and girl twin of Cleopatra. So yes, she did very well. They ended up with quite a wealthy little province there in North Africa. North Africa at the time was quite wealthy. It was one of the bread baskets of Rome, sending a lot of wheat to Rome, and it was very wealthy. It's only poor now because it's had Islam for over 1,000 years, which has wrecked its economy basically. But it was always a very wealthy part of the empire, especially when it was run by the Phoenicians. Carthage was, perhaps the wealthiest city in the whole of the Mediterranean basin. Oh, this is the shipwreck of Saul. Well, we'll come on to that in a minute because that's important. So what happens later on? Okay, so Octavian Augustus, has sorted out his southern border in North Africa. So now he goes east to sort out his eastern borders because the Parthians, the Persians, were the great mortal enemy of Rome, who had defeated Rome on numerous occasions, including defeating Mark Antony and stealing all of his standards, the Roman standards, which were very important to the Roman army. And so he has to sort out his eastern borders. So he gives Phraates IV, who is the king of Parthia, Persia, and he gives Phraates IV a prostitute, a courtesan called Theomusa Orania. And you think this is not going to work. You can't give this important king a courtesan without that king declaring war on Rome. But no, he was Phraates IV was so impressed with this courtesan, this prostitute, that he made her the chief queen of all of Parthia. And later on, I think, let's have a look at her. She was known as Queen Theomusa Orania, another queen who's disappeared from history. I think she was the lost daughter of Cleopatra for many reasons. Yuba II got a daughter of Cleopatra, so surely Phraates IV will have something even better, perhaps another daughter of Queen Cleopatra. And I think that's exactly what he got. So Theomusa Orania was a daughter of Cleopatra, and here she is. So on the right is Queen Theomusa Orania, Queen of Parthia, and on the left is Cleopatra. I think there's a family likeness here, that they are in fact mother and daughter. She poisoned her husband in 2 BC in order that she and her son, who is called Phraatesses, would become the king and queen of all of Parthia, which they did. So she became the queen of Parthia in 2 BC. However, the Parthians were not terribly impressed with all of this, and she got thrown out of the country in AD 4, along with her son and various courtiers and soldiers and whatever. They got thrown out of the country. Now, I think within this story, we have the biblical nativity, because the nativity story is a bit odd. We have a king. Jesus was called a king at his birth and at his crucifixion. He was known as a king. He was called a king on 36 occasions within the New Testament. But we have a king in a state of poverty, who's not in a palace, who can only afford a stable, and a king who is visited by the Persian magi. The magi are the priesthood and the kingmakers of Persia, of Parthia. Why would the Persian priesthood be worried about a Judean carpenter, prince, being born in Judea? What does this have to do with Parthia? That never made any sense. You know, if you're going to have anyone coming to venerate and worship, as it were, the Jesus character, surely it would be someone from Judea, who's supposed to be a Jewish guy, wasn't he? It would be a Jew from Judea. But no, it's the Parthian magi, the priesthood and the kingmakers of Persia, who came to his birth. And here they are. These are the 3 magi. So why were they there at his birth? Well, because this guy was a potential king of Parthia, of Persia. Because they had just left, they had been exiled from Parthia and had gone to Syria, but nevertheless, in some disgrace, of course, because of all of this, you know, the death of the king and so on. But nevertheless, any child born to this family would be a potential king of all of Persia. And this is why, of course, this royal family, we do have a case of a royal family in AD 4. So it's the right era, who was in a state of poverty because they've been thrown out of Parthia, who would be looking for accommodation, a hostel, maybe even a stable. Any child born to this royal family would be of interest to the Parthian priesthood. And that's why they came to see this birth. And this is just this is a mosaic from Anatolia about the 3 magi coming to see the Jesus character, who I think was a son of this, and actually probably not a son of Queen Theomusa Orania, but a son of her daughter, and her daughter would have been this Queen Helena character. So that, I think, is the basis of the nativity story. And we see them all dressed up here, giving the gold, frankincense, and myrrh to this king, and Jesus was a king, and they're wearing the old Phrygian cap, which is an important artifact. It's supposed to be the cap of freedom. I'm not entirely sure where this idea of this being the cap of freedom comes from, but it goes throughout all of history. It's still worn even today by the French. This is the Marianne, the symbol of France, and of course she is wearing a Phrygian cap. And of course the Marianne is just the name they give to Mary Magdalene, of course. So this is Mary Magdalene wearing a Phrygian cap with the same as the Magi do. There we go. It's exactly the same as the Magi. And so this cap of freedom, has become the symbol of France, and you still see it today. Here is a couple of ladies in France wearing the Phrygian cap. So it's quite amazing how these traditions run down through the millennia, and they're still worn today, even by the Smurfs. Okay, so we have this royal family who's come out of Parthia. But remember, this is a very, very well connected royal family. They were connected to Rome because this daughter was most likely a daughter of Julius Caesar. They were linked to Egypt because this daughter was a daughter of Queen Cleopatra. They were now linked to all of Parthia because she had married the king of Parthia. So any sons and daughters born to this family were linked to all of the major powers of the known world at that time. They were the most well-connected royal family in the whole of the world. This is why they were so important. Although they didn't have any lands to rule, they were in exile, as many royal families always do. There's even today, there are exiled royal families all over the place, in Paris or in London or whatever, all in exile, like the exiles from Iran who are now living in New York and so on. All of these exiled royal families, it keeps happening throughout millennia. Royal families still survive. They just move somewhere else, and okay, they're not ruling anymore, but they still have wealth and they still live in different parts of the world. This is exactly what happened to this royal family. I thought they were going to be very poor, but I think actually, because Josephus Flavius gives us two versions of this story. So he gives us the story about Queen Theomusa Aurania. And this was thought of as being fiction, that it was just a ribald story given by Josephus Flavius because of the queen killing her husband and then marrying her son. So Queen Theomusa Aurania married her son. But this was fairly common because incest within royal families was very common. Queen Cleopatra herself married both of her brothers. This is what happened. Agrippa II, we've just talked about him, married his sister Berenike. Now, sometimes these were real marriages, sometimes they were political marriages in order to make the king and queen of the same family. I think this is probably what they were doing here with the mother and son marrying, that she could not really be a queen of all Parthia if she did not have a male consort to be on the throne with her, and so she married her son. This was all supposed to be fiction until the coins of Queen Theomusa Aurania and her son Phraatesses started turning up in finds across Iraq. And so we have the coins of these monarchs on the coins of Parthia. This is the whole business about the nativity, with them being on a journey, something to do with taxation, and therefore having to be in a stable. They were on a journey. They had just been exiled out of Parthia. They were now on a journey and being resettled in somewhere new. They were not in a state of absolute poverty. They didn't have a palace, of course, because they were on the move. They'd just been exiled. But they came out of Parthia, according to Josephus, with 200 courtiers and 600 cavalry. And I think they came out of Parthia with half of the Persian treasury. So although they didn't have anywhere to stay, they weren't short of a few shekels, you might say, because I think they settled into Edessa, and there's many reasons why this, because Moses of Corinne says that Edessa appeared in the 1st century, settled by King Abgarus V, and it just appeared as a major principality along with Palmyra in the eastern Syrian desert. In the 1st century, they suddenly appeared and became very wealthy. And I think they did so because of the wealth that Queen Theomusa Aurania had taken with her when she fled from Parthia. Because Palmyra did exactly the same. I think this was one of their major cities as well. In the 1st century, it went from being a minor caravan town in the Syrian desert to being one of the wealthiest cities in the whole of the Roman Empire. How did that happen? If you look at traditional textbooks, they will say it was done because of commerce, because it was on the caravan routes. Well, I don't think you suddenly become the wealthiest city in the Roman Empire based on caravan proceeds. I think it was because this royal family came out with an awful lot of money and they spent it on these new cities that they founded. And so Palmyra ended up with the largest temple. No, not the largest. Perhaps the most wealthy is a better description of it. In the whole of the Roman Empire. This is the Temple of Bel in Palmyra, a first century temple founded in the early first century, and it became the wealthiest in the Roman Empire because this is the western facade. This has all been destroyed, of course. ISIS blew this up about 10 years ago. So I
Really?
was one of the yeah, I was one of the last to ever see this temple. It was a fantastic temple.
Oh, it looks phenomenal.
Um,
Beautiful.
and ISIS blew the whole thing up. And it had a
Wow.
wonderful zodiac in the roof of it. And this is the eastern facade, and you can see it had all the pillars here. And the pillars are not finished at the top. You can probably see there's no capitals on the top of them. This was because the capitals were made of bronze, which was stupendously expensive. So instead of making the capitals out of stone, they made them out of bronze and wrapped them round the top of the capital. Inordinately expensive. This is why Palmyra is known to be one of the wealthiest cities in the Roman Empire. It was founded in the first century, and I think it's to do with this royal family. And this was the royal family of Queen Helena. So Queen Helena was descended from this royal family. And again, she has gone missing from history. Queen Helena, in my estimation, was the daughter of Theomusa Orania. So she
Yeah.
was the next generation on. And she
Okay.
became the Queen of Judea in AD 50. Based upon this famine relief money, we were talking about the famine relief money that was sent by Queen Helena and King Abgarus of Edessa.
Hmm.
She became the Queen of Judea. This is her palace in Jerusalem, which was the largest palace in the whole of Jerusalem. This comes from the AD 50s. And this is her tomb in Jerusalem, the largest tomb in Jerusalem.
Wow.
So this family became the de facto king and queen of the Jews in the AD 50s. And again, that's not widely known because the Jews don't want you to know that they were ruled by a Syrian queen in the AD 50s. But she became a Jew. She was a Jew herself. Queen Helena converted to Judaism, according to the Talmud. So the Talmud tells us this. It's all there in the books if you look it up. And this is her sarcophagus, which is now in the Louvre. Funny little story with this sarcophagus because I found this, well, sort of.
You found it.
Yeah, well, for the second time. It was found by Delucy or Selucy, who was a French archaeologist back in the 19th century, and it was given to the Louvre in Paris. So I went to the Louvre to get some pictures of it, and it wasn't there. So I asked the curators, "Where is the sarcophagus of Queen Helena?" And they said, "We have no such thing." Oh, okay. Well, thanks very much. So I went back off home again. And this is in the before the internet era. So we couldn't do this was all done by letters backwards
Wow.
and forwards to the Louvre. So I went back home again and I found a reference in the Times of London of this sarcophagus being given to the Louvre. So I sent, a photocopy of this extract from the Times, and they finally came back to me. And this took more than a year to get this, and they finally said, "Oh, we've found it in a warehouse."
Oh.
And you can imagine this sort of vast warehouse full of boxes, like something out of
Mm.
Indiana Jones or something. And they found this sarcophagus. And they said, "Okay, we'll put it back in the Louvre again because it's not been there for like decades or more." So I went back to the Louvre and it wasn't there. So I asked the curator, "Well, where's this sarcophagus?" And they said, "Oh, we've sent it to Israel." Because there was some opening of some museum in Israel. So they sent it to Israel, to Jerusalem.
They really didn't want it at the Louvre, did they?
They didn't know. So I had to go back home again and go back to the Louvre another 6 months later when it arrived back in the Louvre. So this was my photo of this sarcophagus after I'd rediscovered it because it hadn't been on view for over a century. So finally, it's now in the Louvre, and you can actually see the sarcophagus of Queen Helena, who was the queen of. Now, if you look at it in real history, she is the queen of Adiabene, but Adiabene doesn't exist. I'm pretty sure that that is just a pseudonym that Josephus Flavius invented for Edessa, because remember, Edessa has been deleted from history. Josephus never mentions it. But he has to mention this story because this story is important in first century Judea. And so he just calls them Adiabene instead. So this was Queen Helena of the Adiabene, who was the queen of Edessa, who was married to King Abgarus of Edessa, the king of Edessa, who became the queen of Judea in the AD 50s on the back of this famine relief money. I mean, it's the obvious way to become influential in a region is you have a famine in the region and you come down into that region with lots of money and you spend it to buy grain from Egypt and figs from Greece in order to save the people. God bless you, Queen Helena. You can imagine what they were saying. And on the back of that, she became a Nazarene Jew, according to the Talmud. And remember that Jesus was a Nazarene Jew. They're both of the same sect of Judaism. And she became the Queen of Judea, building the largest palace and tomb in Jerusalem and furnishing the Temple of Jerusalem with all of its artifacts, including the solid gold menorah, which was eventually taken to Rome by Vespasian after the Jewish revolt. And the money from that gold menorah went to build the Colosseum in Rome. So that's a potted history of this royal family in Judea.
So Arania had Helena.
Yes, so I think that the daughter of Queen Theomusa Orania was Queen Helena, who was the queen of Edessa. Although you won't find that in the historical books, this has only been deduced by myself and Professor Robert Eisenman. I think Eisenman came out with it first. This all comes from Moses of Corine and several of the other Syriac historians who say that Queen Helena was married to King Abgarus of Edessa. And that way we know that she was the queen of Edessa. And we've already seen the links between Edessa and the gospel story. So yes, this royal family were very important in the gospel story. And I think we mentioned in the previous talk, didn't we, about the Knights Templar? Did we talk about Knights Templar? Well, as a quick reminder, because we will do this as a part of the Arthurian story later on if we do a talk on King Arthur. When the First Crusade went over to the East, this was in 1096, they didn't go straight away to Jerusalem. They got to the northeast corner of the Mediterranean and then they carried on due east and they went across the Euphrates. And the first town they liberated from Islamic control and oppression was Edessa. So even in this era, the Crusaders knew that Edessa was important to this story. That's why they went there. They went to Edessa because they knew it was central to this story. That's why Alfred the Great had already sent his ambassadors to Edessa and to the Edessan church in India because they knew that this city was important to the story. We don't now because nobody knows about Edessa. As I've said, most of your viewers will probably never have heard of Edessa, the same as I hadn't. But in the Middle Ages, it was known that Edessa was central to the gospel story. That's why the Crusaders went there. Because if you were going to find some information, because this was all about saving Christianity from Islamic control, of course. If you wanted any secret information about Christianity, you weren't going to find it in Jerusalem. You were going to find it in Edessa. And so they would be over there looking for artifacts, genealogies maybe, histories, chronicles that had been left over from the gospel era that were in Edessa that had been hidden from the Western world for hundreds of years, hidden by the Council of Nicaea, hidden by the Council of Chalcedon, which split the Western Church from the Eastern Church. So the Western Church in Rome had no control over what Edessa was writing about the Gospel era. And so if you're going to find any interesting books, you weren't going to find them in Jerusalem so much, you were going to find them in Edessa. And the books that they would be looking for is something like The History of the Kings of Judea by Justus of Tiberias. Now, we know about this book because Josephus Flavius writes about it, and he hates it. He says that Justus of Tiberias was a complete charlatan and wrote absolute lies. Well, what he means is he wrote a history that was different to the one being written by Josephus Flavius. So that book was giving the opposite view to Josephus Flavius. Now, we don't have that book. It's gone. Josephus Flavius ensured that it went missing because he didn't want anyone to disagree with what he was saying. And so that book's gone. But what did that book say? What was the alternative view of not only of Judaism, but of first century Judaism and the Jewish revolt? It would be very interesting to have that book. And I think that's what they found in Edessa. They found the secular history of this royal family. So rather than the gospel history of this royal family, I think they found the secular history. So why do I link this story in with Jesus? Well, for many reasons, really. Where should we go to? The doctrine of Addai is a story, it's an apocryphal gospel about Addai and Thomas being sent to Edessa. So there are gospels, even though they're apocryphal, of people being sent to Edessa. No, the other way around. So Edessa sent ambassadors down to Judea to go and see Jesus. And this comes from the doctrine of Addai. There are several versions of this online. There's the original Syriac version, and there's one by Eusebius, and there's another one by Moses of Corinne. So this was a well-known story. So the king of Edessa, who's King Abgarus of Edessa, has an ailment, and he sends an ambassador down to Jesus in Judea to get a cure. In fact, he's asking for Jesus to come to Edessa and to see him and to cure him. And Jesus says, "No, I'm busy, sorry, but I'll send you." He sends an ambassador back, and he sends a picture, which is variously interpreted, back to Edessa to the king in order to cure him. Now, in the original story, this was a picture made with paints, but in the slightly more fanciful stories by Eusebius, it becomes the miraculous mandilion, which was supposed to be a cloth that was put on the face of Jesus, and his image of his face was impregnated upon this cloth. And that's the mandilion that was taken back to Edessa. But in reality, it was a real picture made with oil paints. But that eventually became, the Shroud of Turin was a copy of the Mandilion of Edessa. You can see how closely related Edessa is to this story. Now, there's a few problems with this doctrine of Addai story. Firstly, it has to be in the AD 20s for Jesus still to be alive. So they write it with the emperor for the AD 20s to make it fit with the classical sort of chronology of the Gospels. But the governor of Syria, who's given in the story, is the wrong governor. It's the governor from the AD 50s. So we know that this was an AD 50s story, not an AD 20s story. And effectively, that this was a copy of the Council of Jerusalem. So I don't know if listeners will know about the Council of Jerusalem. It comes from Acts chapter 15, if you want to look it up. So they were trying to convert the people of Antioch to Nazarene Judaism, the Judaism of Jesus and James. And so there were ambassadors being sent backwards and forwards between Antioch and Jerusalem, talking about the conversion of the people of Antioch to Judaism. Now, this was obviously a very famous story because I've come across about 5 different versions of this story. What they won't tell you is that Antioch was Edessa. They just say Antioch, and everybody, I am the first person, I can pretty much guarantee this, who has said that this is Edessa. So they say Antioch, and everyone expects that this is Antioch Orontes, which is on the Mediterranean coast. It's called Antakya nowadays. It's in modern Anatolia. And so they think they're talking about this city here. But of course, Edessa was called Antioch in the Roman annals. It's called Antioch Edessa. So I don't think they were talking about Antioch Orontes. I think they were talking about Antioch Edessa. And what they were talking about was this same business with the doctrine of Addai, of the ambassadors going backwards and forwards to Edessa to cure the king of his ailment. And that ailment was circumcision, or perhaps castration. We'll come on to that in a minute. Because we have the same story from Josephus. But of course, Josephus cannot mention Edessa. Edessa was forbidden. You weren't allowed to mention it. So he says This was Adiabene, and the ambassadors were going backwards and forwards to Adiabene in order to convert the royal family, so not just the people, but the royal family of Adiabene, into Nazarene Judaism. And the central part of this story was circumcision. Was the royal family going to be circumcised? This is exactly what Acts 15 is talking about as well, with the Council of Jerusalem. Did the people of Antioch need to be circumcised in order to become Nazarene Jews? And there was a moderate, so in the Josephus version, there was a moderate called Ananias who went up and said, no, you don't need to be circumcised, you can still be Jewish. And then the hardliner, who was Eleazar, he went up and said, no, you've got to be circumcised. And of course, again, this fits in with the doctrine of Addai, because the ambassador who came down to see Jesus and made a painting of him was called Hanan. And then you read Josephus Flavius, and the ambassador is called Anan or Ananias. It's quite obviously the same story. So this was all a story. And remember that Adiabene is Edessa, because the queen of Adiabene, Queen Helena, was the queen of Edessa. So, we're back to Edessa again. This was a story about the conversion of the royal family of Edessa to Nazarene Judaism and whether they had to be circumcised or not. And this was important because Josephus Flavius gives us a rather fuller version of this. The concern was that if they converted to Nazarene Judaism and they got circumcised, that the people that they ruled would rebel because the royal family were doing something that the people themselves didn't want. And there was a rebellion, according to the historical side of this story. And the royal family of Emesa, this is a different place. There were two places. One was called Edessa. One was called Emesa. Emesa is Damascus, basically, down in Syria. They started a war with the Edessans over this business of conversion to Judaism, because Queen Helena did become a Nazarene Jew. We know this from the Talmud, as I've said before. So this was an important point, that the conversion of this royal family, the Edessan royal family, was very controversial. And that's why they had the Council of Jerusalem, which is given in Acts of the Apostles. And in Acts of the Apostles, they went the simple route. And so Saul, who was an ambassador of Edessa, as we've said from before, was the moderate, and he was saying, no, you don't have to be circumcised. And so he went to James, the brother of Jesus, and he agreed. And he said, well, no, you don't have to be. Here are the 4 rules of simple Judaism. And they were that you mustn't drink blood or eat blood. You mustn't eat meat that was sacrificed to idols. You mustn't eat strangled animals because they still had the blood in them. And you mustn't commit fornication, which generally means incest. And they were the 4 rules of simple Judaism, which he went back to Edessa to teach there. That's why Saul became the ambassador to the Gentiles, because he was no longer preaching to Jews, he was preaching to the Gentiles with this version of simple Judaism, which had been given to him by James, the brother of Jesus. Now, this is what we know as Christianity. So Christianity was not the church of Jesus and James. It was the church of Saul. And they became enemies with each other. And eventually it was the simple Judaism of Jesus that won this battle. And so anyone who is believing in Christianity is believing in the religion of the enemy of Jesus, because Jesus was a Nazarene Jew. He wasn't a simple Judaic. He wasn't a Christian. That was what they were talking about, was this conversion of the royal family of Edessa to Judaism, and whether they need to be circumcised. And I don't think this was about circumcision. Again, I think there's been a cover-up here, because the Church of Jesus and James believed in castration instead. So this wasn't about circumcision, this was about castration. And I don't know if listeners know about this, but Jesus asked for his disciples to castrate themselves. Again, this is not taught. Of course, the church won't teach this. But this comes from Matthew 19:11. So you can look it up. Matthew 19:11, have a look at it. Jesus says, all men cannot receive this saying except to those whom it is given to. For there are some eunuchs who were born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men, and there are some eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. So he that is able to castrate himself, they should castrate themselves. Why? Well, because these were the Galileans. And remember that Jesus was a Galilean. It says so in the New Testament. Luke 23:6 and 22:59, he's called a Galilean. And so is Peter. St. Peter was called a Galilean in Mark 14:70. They were Galileans, and the Galileans were the eunuch priests of Gibel, or Sibel, some people say, but it's Gibel really. Because the young partner of Gibel was Attis, who was a castrato. And this is the religion that they were connected with. This is why Jesus was asking for his disciples to castrate themselves. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. So Jesus was asking for his disciples to castrate themselves because this was a well-known sect in this era. In fact, the Romans didn't like it. It was forbidden in Rome. But in the East, this was quite a well-known sect. And we have a quote about the Galileans, from Lucian. And he says that on these days, the Galileans, become Galli. While the rest are playing flutes and performing rites, a frenzy comes upon many, and he throws off his clothes and rushes to the center with a great shout and takes up a sword and immediately castrates himself. Then he rushes through the city holding his testicles in his hands, and he takes female clothing and women's adornments from whichever house he throws the testicles into. These were the testicle tossers of Syria. And this was quite a large belief system and religion, because the priests of the Elagabal will come on. No, we talked about the Elagabal stone last time, didn't we? The sacred stone.
Yeah.
The priests of the sacred stone had to be castrated. And this is how they castrated themselves. But we get the same from Josephus Flavius, that these priests were also warriors. So Josephus Flavius, this comes from War 4910, so you can look it up in Jewish war. And Josephus says, the Galileans, and remember that Jesus and Peter were both Galileans. The Galileans indulged themselves in feminine wantonness. They decked their hair and put on women's garments and were smeared with ointments that they may appear very comely. They had paints under their eyes and imitated not only the ornaments but also the lusts of women. But while their faces looked like the faces of women, they killed with their right hands, and while their gait was effeminate, they attacked men and became warriors and drew their swords from under their finely dyed dresses and ran everybody through who they alighted upon. So these were... This is talking about the Jewish revolt. During the Jewish revolt, they had these Sicarii, what do you call them, daggermen, who created mayhem by mixing with the festival crowds and stabbing people with small daggers, the Sicarii. And of course, the disciples, some of the disciples were Sicarii. Judas Iscariot is the Sicarii, because he was a Sicarii daggerman. This is all to do with the Jewish revolt. And this was also to do with the Galileans. And the Galileans were the people who venerated and owned the Elagabal sacred stone. So it's quite a different story to what people are familiar with. This is a coin of a king of Edessa. And as you can see, the kings of Edessa wore a crown of thorns. So this is where the story comes from, of Jesus being crucified with a crown of thorns. It comes from the Edessans, because all of the Edessan monarchs, this is a later monarch from the 3rd century, late 2nd century or the early 3rd century in Edessa. And all of the Edessan kings wore the same crown of thorns. In fact, it's a plaited crown of thorns. You can see the plaits on the side of the crown. That's exactly what it says in the Gospels. John 19:2, and it says, the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. So it was a plaited crown of thorns, just as this one is a plaited crown of thorns. And they put on a purple robe on him because that was the symbol of the Emperor of Rome. Because remember that this, in the secular world, this was a dispute against Rome. We saw this with the parable of the vineyard owner.
Mm-hmm.
In order to take over Rome, well, to at least get rid of the Romans in Judea, because there was a tax revolt over this. That's why the Edessans declared war on the Romans in Judea. But this was not just simply a Judean problem, a taxation problem in Judea. The real problem was that the throne of Rome was empty. The whole of this dispute, the New Testament dispute, was a move by the Edessan kings in order to become the Emperor of Rome. Because remember, this was a very, very well-connected royal family. As I said, they were connected to Rome, to Greece and Egypt through Cleopatra, and to all of Parthia. So they were the most well-connected royal family in the Roman Empire, but they didn't have really a throne to sit upon. And so they started the Jewish revolt as a method of trying to take over the throne of Rome, because the throne of Rome was empty at the time. It started in AD 66 when everybody knew that Nero was a dead man walking. And, oh yes, we haven't been through Epaphroditus yet, have we? Perhaps we ought to do that just very quickly before we get on to the throne of Rome, because there is another secret within the gospel story, and that is, who was Josephus? There is a problem with the gospel story that everybody is missing from the historical record. You know, Jesus and James are all missing from the historical record, but so is Saul. And Saul is perhaps the most important person within the gospel story, and yet he's missing from the historical record. This is the guy who wrote half of the New Testament and probably had his hand in the rest of it. How are all of these people missing from the historical record? I don't think he is missing. I think people just don't want to acknowledge who he was. Because acknowledging who he was changes the story somewhat. It changes the timeline, that's for sure. But we've already seen the timeline has been changed. So who was Saul? St. Paul, the most important person perhaps in the gospel story. We can find him by finding a similar character. We're not going to find the name Saul, but we're going to find a very, very similar character in the historical record. So both of these people, both Saul and the person who I think is very similar to him, both of them were Jews. Both were raised in Jerusalem. Both had Roman citizenship. Now, that was unusual. Not every Jew had Roman citizenship, that's for sure. So we're honing this in onto only a couple of hundred people at most. They were both Pharisees. They both became rabbis. They were both had short hair. Now, we know that Saul didn't like long hair, because remember, the Jews had long hair, and the Nazarene Jews, the Nazarene were the Church of Jesus and James, they most definitely had long hair because they were Nazarene, and the Nazarene were not allowed to cut their hair. That's why a traditional image of Jesus always has Jesus with long hair and a beard, just as all of the kings of Edessa all had long hair and beards because they were Nazarene and they were not allowed to cut their hair. But Saul says, does nature not teach you that long hair is shameful on a man? 1 Corinthians 11:14. So he obviously didn't have long hair. And Josephus does the same. We'll come on to why this is important in a minute. He says, when any have made a sacred vow, I mean, they who are called the Nazarites, the Nazarene, that suffer their hair to grow long. So he is differentiating himself from the Nazarene who had long hair. So it's quite obvious that Josephus had short hair as well. So both of these people were revolutionaries who worked with the Jewish authorities against, no, we'll come on to that in a minute. Both of them had a vision of a man telling them of the error of their ways. So you remember Saul had his vision on the road to Damascus, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Well, this other guy had the same. He had a vision. They both traveled widely in Europe and returned to Jerusalem. They were both stoned by their opponents while they were away, and they were both on the same prison ship going to Rome. So Saul was on a prison ship because he was in jail for a number of years, as we've said before. Now, the governor of Judea could not decide whether he was innocent or guilty, so he sent him to Nero in Rome for Nero to decide. Now that shows you how important this character was, because you don't send a tent maker to Rome in order to plead his case before the emperor. You know, if you've got a street sweeper who's guilty of something in Australia, you don't send him to the premier of Australia to decide his innocence or guilt. Saul manages to get sent to Rome to go and see Nero. And so does this other character, also gets sent on the same prison ship, and they were both shipwrecked because this ship got wrecked on Malta. So they were both shipwrecked on Malta. They were both taken to Naples, and they both went to see Nero in Rome. Oh, they both ended up as authors sending letters all over the Roman Empire, and they both had the same publisher who was called Epaphroditus. So there was a number of connections between these two people. Now, the one was called Saul, and the other was called Josephus Flavius. So Saul was Josephus Flavius, the historian who wrote this story for Emperor Vespasian. Now, the reason why this is unpalatable to any Christians is because it changes the timeline. It has to be the AD 60s and not the AD 20s. It's unpalatable because Saul was a Jewish traitor who was a terrible character. He was only ever interested in one person, himself. He was a terrible egotist, hugely untrustworthy. He was known as the liar. Nobody would want the primary character who's writing most of this story in the Gospels to be Josephus Flavius. And it changes the timeline. It means that the gospel story has to be something to do with the Jewish revolt. Okay, that's why they wouldn't want it. But the interesting thing about this connection is it becomes explanatory. So it explains many things that you would not otherwise be able to explain, which is always a good sign of a theory if it manages to explain things. And it explains why Saul was chasing Jesus around Galilee. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? As Jesus said. Because this other character, Josephus Flavius, was the army commander in charge of Galilee who was persecuting Jesus in Galilee, Jesus of Gamala. So they were both persecuting a guy called Jesus. More importantly, it explains how Saul was putting these people in prison. So Acts 8:3, it says Saul made havoc on the church of Jesus and James, entering into every house and committing them to prison. And then in Acts 22:4, it says, I, Saul, persecuted them unto death, binding and delivering men and women into prison. Now, how was Saul, as a tent maker, putting people in prison, arresting them obviously on behalf of the government, the Jewish government, and putting these people in prison? How was he doing that? He was just a tent maker. Nobody has ever explained that. But of course, as Josephus Flavius was the army commander in command of Galilee. And what he was doing there in Galilee is he was chasing a guy called Jesus of Gamala, around Galilee, arresting them and putting them into prison. He was doing exactly the same as Saul was. So they're not only the same events, apparently, but it explains what could not be explained before from Acts of the Apostles, that Saul was somehow a chief of police who was arresting people, but it's not said how on earth that could be done because he was only a tent maker. Well, now we know how that's done. He was the army commander in charge of Galilee, and his name was Josephus Flavius. That explains why the governors came to see Saul when he was in prison. And the king and queen of Judea came to see him as well. Agrippa II and Berenike came to see Saul while he was in jail. Why was that? Well, because he was Josephus Flavius. And Josephus Flavius himself was very important. That's why he was made army commander in charge of Galilee. But he was the first of the 12 priestly sects within Judaism, and he was of royal blood. It says so in the works of Josephus. Yeah, he was the first of the 24 courses the priesthood in Judea. So he was obviously a wealthy and important person. And he was supposed to be also descended from the Hasmonean royal line. So he was important. It would explain his association with the famine story. Yeah, it explains why he was a tent maker, because he was an important person instead. It also explains the two contenders for the position of discipleship after Judas was killed or left or whatever happened to him. That's too complicated. I won't go into that, but it explains the two people, the two contenders for the position of disciple after Judas died. And it explains the shift in the timeline. Now, one of the troubles with this connection is this cannot be the AD 20s, it has to be the AD 60s, because Josephus was only born in AD 37. Now, that seems like a problem, but it's not, because when you read the gospel story, all the way through the gospel story, you see pointers indicating that this was actually a later story about the Jewish revolt, because Jesus describes Jerusalem being surrounded by a trench and a wall, and not one stone being laid upon the other. Now, that is a direct quote from Josephus Flavius about the Jewish revolt, because the Romans surrounded Jerusalem by a wall and a trench. Now, Jesus is explaining that this is what he can see of Jerusalem. It's supposed to be a prophecy, but that description comes from the works of Josephus. It explains the mention of Zacharias Baruch or Zacharias Barachias. Now, Jesus mentions this guy and he laments his death, but this is a well-known death between the temple and the altar on the Temple Mount, where this guy was cut down between the temple and the altar, and Jesus is lamenting his death. But the trouble is, this death happened in the AD 60s, the late AD 60s, during the Jewish revolt. So how did that happen? Well, quite obviously, the story is actually a later story. And also, Jesus quotes the story about Zizit ben Hakaseth. Now, again, you won't find this in any biblical or historical text, because I think I'm the first person to have noticed this yet again. So Jesus says, this comes from Matthew 22:5. He's talking about Zizit ben Hakaseth, but you wouldn't know that, because he says he's criticizing the aristocrats in Jerusalem. And he says all of their works they do to be seen by men. They make broad their phylacteries and enlarge their fringes, and they love the uppermost rooms at feasts and the chief seats in the synagogue. Now, that might not mean much, but fringes are zizit and seats are kiseth. Zizit ben Hakaseth. He's talking about Zizit ben Hakaseth. And we know this because the Talmud gives the same mockery. And the Talmud says, he then sent against the Jews Vespasian, the Caesar. He wasn't the Caesar at that time, he was just a commander, actually. Vespasian came and besieged Jerusalem for 3 years. There were in it 3 men of great wealth, Nacedemon ben Gorion, Ben Kalba Shalbua, and Ben Zizit Hakeseth. Ben Zizit Hakeseth was so called because his fringes used to trail on the cushions. Again, that's a play on words, because the fringes are a zizith and the cushions are a keseth. And his name is Zizit ben Hakeseth. They're playing on words, as they always do. Now, this was one of the aristocrats, the 3 aristocrats, who said that they could keep Jerusalem in a siege for 25 years. That was the level of their wealth. And Jesus is mocking this guy in the same manner. The trouble being that this guy was an aristocrat during the Jewish revolt of AD 66. You see the problem with this. This is an AD 60s story. And we get the same problem with the Egyptian false prophet. And some people criticize me for making this connection, but it's pretty obvious that they are the same. In the works of Josephus and also in Acts of the Apostles, there is this guy called the Egyptian false prophet. And it's pretty obvious that the Egyptian false prophet is Jesus, because it is the Egyptian who took the 5,000 out into the wilderness. And it was the Egyptian false prophet who had the night gathering on the Mount of Olives in order to take Jerusalem. Now, who took the 5,000 out into the wilderness? Well, that was Jesus. Who had the night meeting on the Mount of Olives that was interrupted by the Roman guard? In both cases, it was interrupted by the Roman guard. and they were dispersed, you might say. Well, that was Jesus, of course, did that. So it's quite obvious that Jesus was being known as the Egyptian false prophet because he came out of Egypt. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Jesus went to Egypt for his education, of course. That's where he fled for his education. And of course, he did come out of Egypt because his great grandmother would have been Queen Cleopatra. He came out of Egypt. He had an Egyptian heritage, and he would have gone to somewhere like Alexandria for his education. The problem with this conflation that Jesus was the Egyptian false prophet, which he obviously was, is the Egyptian false prophet was a guy from the AD 50s and 60s. This business of trying to take Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives that was interrupted by the Roman Guard was a part of the Jewish revolt in AD 66, or just before AD 66. So again, we're talking about an AD 60s story. And Jesus was the Egyptian false prophet. That was the name they gave him because he had this Egyptian heritage. We are talking about the gospel story is an AD 60s story. Now, the reason they've put it back into the AD 20s is political, because they didn't want you to know that this was all about the Jewish revolt. That was why the revolt started. As I was saying before, the throne of Rome was empty at the time. Well, AD 66, everybody knew that Emperor Nero was a dead man walking. Mm-hmm. By AD 68, he was dead. In fact, he was killed by Epaphroditus, who was probably the translator and the editor who worked for Saul and worked for Josephus Flavius. It was probably the same guy who actually killed Emperor Nero. So by AD 68, the throne of Rome was empty, and it was open to whoever could grab it. Whoever had the largest treasury and the most soldiers could take the throne of Rome. And of course, many people tried to do so. This was the year of 4 emperors. 4 emperors came and went in quick succession. They all threw their hat into the ring, tried to take the throne, and were defeated by the next person. And I think what happened here is this was actually the year of 5 emperors, not 4. And the 5th emperor was this king of Edessa, who we've not actually named at present, because that is interesting as well, because the king of Edessa at this time was called King Esus Manu. King of Edessa at this time was called King Esus Manu VI of Edessa. Now, Esus, obviously, Isa or Isus, is very much like the Jesus that we know from the Greek, Eusus from the Greek. But in the Syriac, he was also called Issa, and Issa is the Mesopotamian, well, certainly the Arabic name for Jesus. Jesus was called Issa. And this king of Edessa, his name, if you look it up in the works of Josephus, his name in the works of Josephus, because he says that he was a king of Adiabene, which doesn't exist. His name was Izates. Izates the 6th of Edessa. But Josephus gives him a short name, and the short name is either Issa or Issus. And that's where we get the name for Jesus over in Mesopotamia, where he's always called Issa. And he is in India as well. They call him Issa, because this king of Edessa was indeed called Edessa. And then, of course, this explains also why we get this strange prophecy by Jesus. This comes from Matthew 1:23. And it says, "Behold, a virgin will be with child, and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which is being interpreted, God with us. And this has to be the most stupid prophecy ever. This is a prophecy that Jesus will become the Messiah, will become the Christ, because his name is Emmanuel. But of course, Jesus was never called Emmanuel anywhere in the New Testament. So what's it talking about? Well, this is standard Pesher prophecy, where they take, this comes out of the Old Testament, of course, and it's being interpreted into the modern era, the 1st century era. And this is what they always did with Pesher, within the Talmud especially, is in order to make a prophecy, they go through the Old Testament and they try to find events or people that are similar to what is going on. And then you can use those events from the Old Testament, because you know what happened in the Old Testament. You can use that for prophecy, for what's happening in the current time, on the basis, I suppose, that, history repeats itself. Or as someone said, history does not repeat, but it definitely rhymes. And so you can use elements in the Old Testament to predict what will happen in the future. This is known as Pesha. And what they're doing here is very much the same. They're trawling through the Old Testament to find something that is similar. Not in this case for prophecy so much, because this prophecy never came true. Jesus was never called Emmanuel, but in order to hide a secret, because they often hid people's names by confusing their names with someone in the Old Testament. And that's what they're doing here. They will call his name Emmanuel. And of course, the king of Edessa was called Manu. This is why they've used this piece of Pesha prophecy, because it will give the hint to anyone who's initiated into the secrets of the New Testament as to who the Jesus character was. They can say to someone who's not been initiated, why is he called Emmanuel? Someone who knows maybe the history of Edessa. Well, I don't know. Why is he called Emmanuel? Manu, the king of Edessa. Ah, that's why he's called Emmanuel, because he was the king of Edessa. So Jesus, being called Jesus Emmanuel, has the same name as the king of Edessa at that time in the AD 60s, who was called King Jesus Manu VI, who was the king of Edessa, and he was the king of Judea, because remember, he had become a Nazarene Jew. His mother had become a Nazarene Jew, and she was the de facto queen of Judea, with the largest tomb and the largest palace in Jerusalem. They were the de facto king and queen of not only of Judea, but the king of the Jews. And of course, Jesus was known as the king of the Jews. He was called that on numerous occasions. So that is the character who became king of the Jews and was fighting against the Romans. Now, the Jewish revolt is very badly taught within history and within theology. Within theology, they sort of try and ignore it. Don't mention it at all. It's as if the Romans were never there in Judea. Within real history, if you read the history of the Jewish revolt, it will not tell you who started the Jewish revolt or what it was for, what was the reason for this revolt. But if you read through the works of Josephus, it seems to be quite clear to me who started the Jewish revolt, because it says in Jewish War 2:19:2, at the outbreak of the war, it says the most valiant in the battle against Cestius. Cestius was the Roman army commander who commanded the legion, the Syrian legion, that went down to Jerusalem to put down the revolt. And his legion, the entire legion, was destroyed by the Jews. That was the outbreak of war, because once you've destroyed a Roman legion, there's no going back. Now you're at war with Rome. It is said of this, the most valiant in the battle against Cestius was the kinsman of Monobazus, the king of Adiabene, and their names were Monobazus and Kenadius. Well, Adiabene, as we've known, is Edessa, because the queen of Edessa, the queen of Adiabene, Queen Helena, was married to the king of Edessa, King Abgarus. So when it's talking about Adiabene, it's talking about Edessa, but Edessa has been banned from the works of Josephus. You're not allowed to mention it. And then we come to the end of the Jewish revolt, which is War 664, the surrender to Rome. It says that on that day, it was the sons and brethren of King Izates, King Ezus, who besought Caesar to give them his right hand for their security. He kept them all in custody, but still bound the king's sons and kinsmen and led them to Rome with him, in order to make them hostages for their country's fidelity to the Romans. So King Izates is King Ezus of Edessa, because that was the king of Edessa at this time. And Caesar, when he's talking about Caesar, he's talking about Titus and Vespasian, who won the Jewish revolt against the Jews in AD 70 and destroyed Jerusalem, of course, and destroyed the temple. And they are being held in custody and taken to Rome in chains. Now, there are some of my critics who, I don't know why they say this. I think they are brain dead. I don't know. But some of my critics have said that This means that the Adiabeni Edessans, the monarchy, were allies of Rome because they were given their right hand of security from Caesar, from Vespasian. Therefore, they must have been allies. And you think, hold on a minute, what planet are these people on sometimes? These are the people who destroyed the legion of Cestius. They destroyed an entire legion, 6,000 men, at the outbreak of war. Now they are surrendering to Rome after the fall of Jerusalem. And they are asking for the right hand of security from Vespasian and Titus. But they were put into jail, into custody, and then they were taken in chains to Rome in order to make them hostages for their country's fidelity. These were not allies of Rome, these were enemies of Rome.
Mm.
And my critics cannot understand what happens in real war. You're not always able to kill your enemies in real war. That's not how war happens. And the example I normally give is of Napoleon. Britain defeated Napoleon, but he had so many supporters, obviously, within France that it was very difficult to kill him. And so he was sent to prison on Elba, which is an island down in the Mediterranean. But he escaped from Elba and started a second war, which was he was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. But still, Britain did not kill Napoleon because he had too many supporters in France. And the last thing that Britain wanted was to start another uprising in France because we had just killed their emperor. And so he was sent down to St. Helena, familiar name, which is an island down in the South Atlantic. And since Britain ruled the waves, there was no way he was going to escape from St. Helena. So again, this very important character who had started a revolt against, the rest of Europe, not just Britain, was not able to be executed after he lost. He had to be sent into exile in order to, as it says here, in order to make him a hostage for his country's fidelity to the Britons, i.e., France. If you do things we don't like, we're going to kill your emperor.
Mm.
So he became a hostage. That's exactly what happened to the king and the princes of the Edessan monarchs. They were kept as hostages for their country's fidelity to the Romans, because not all of the Edessans had started a war against Rome. There were factions, obviously, who had not, and had not joined in the revolt. And of course, Rome was interested in what these people were going to do. Were they going to start another revolt, or whether they were they going to keep the peace? Rome didn't know. And so they wanted a hostage. And that's why they were keeping these people as hostage. Josephus says so in his preface. So during the war, Josephus says that the Jews who started the Jewish revolt hoped that all of their nation beyond the Euphrates would have raised an insurrection together with them. So what's he saying there? That the Jews beyond the Euphrates, who are they? That's the Edessans, because Edessa is beyond the Euphrates. The prince and the king of Edessa, who happened to be in Judea at the time, remember Queen Helena became the queen of the Jews, and so her son would have become the king of the Jews down in Judea. He wasn't in Edessa at the time. He was down in the south. He was in Judea. And they were hoping that all of their nation beyond the Euphrates would have raised an insurrection with them. That's talking about Edessa. That's talking about Palmyra, hoping that all of the Edessans would come to help them in this revolt against Rome. But they didn't. So there was a split here between the monarchy, as Josephus was saying before. And then after the revolt finished, Josephus is busy writing all of these books. So after he's written the books, he then goes to write them in Greek. So he says, I have proposed, for the sake of those who live in Rome, to translate these books into the Greek tongue, which I formerly composed in the language of our country and sent to the upper barbarians.
Mm.
Now, the upper barbarians are those beyond the Euphrates. Who is he talking about? He's talking about the Edessans. The first books that he sent, that he actually wrote and composed and sent out, were written in Aramaic, the language of his nation, and they were sent to the upper barbarians beyond the Euphrates. They were sent to Edessa. Why? Because Edessa started this revolt. And this was a warning to the Edessans because basically his Jewish war said the Romans are invincible. Why are you bothering revolting against Rome? You're always going to lose against Rome. And they were miserably destroyed. These books were written as a warning to Edessa: don't revolt against Rome. Your compatriots did down in Syria and down in Judea. They revolted. Don't you dare revolt against Rome, because we will do exactly the same to you as we've just done to Jerusalem. We will come and destroy you. So this was a warning. That's why Josephus was commissioned by Vespasian to write these books as a warning against the Edessans not to attack Rome, to remain in peace. This is why, they were not allies. We know they were not allies. The other thing, these books were sent to the upper barbarians, and that's been translated in the normal fashion where barbarians is taken to mean someone who's unsophisticated, uncivilized. I don't think that means that at all. And again, I'm the first person to retranslate this. He's always calling these people barbarians. But barbarian is normally meant to mean someone with a different language. But of course, the Edessans had the same language. They spoke Aramaic. As Josephus has just said, they spoke Aramaic, the language of our country. So what's the difference? Why are they being called barbarians? Well, the difference is that Josephus and Saul had short hair in the Roman fashion, and they were shaven. They used to shave their beards in the Roman fashion. The Edessans had long hair and beards. And so barbarian in this case is referring to a barber, which is Latin for hair and beard, which is why nowadays when you get shaven, you go to a barber. That's what it's meaning when it's talking about barbarians. It's meaning the Edessans because they had long hair and beards.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, that's why you have to interpret these books very carefully. It has nothing to do with language. The Edessans spoke Aramaic, the same as the Jews in Galilee did. And there's another one here from Josephus. He says, while the Parthians and the Babylonians and the remotest Arabians and those of our nation beyond the Euphrates with the Adiabeni, by my means knew accurately whence the war begun and what miseries it brought upon us, and in what manner it ended. So again, he's talking about those of our nation with the Adiabeni beyond the Euphrates. Now, the Adiabeni are the Edessans. We've already shown that. And they lay beyond the Euphrates, yes, because Edessa is beyond the Euphrates. They knew what had happened during the Jewish revolt. But the Greeks and the Romans did not. And that's why they rewrote these books into Greek. Because remember, we don't have the Aramaic versions. They've gone lost, they've gone missing. We only have the Greek versions, but the Greek versions were translations of the original Aramaic. And remember that this translation was done by Epaphroditus, who was the editor and publisher, I suppose you might call him, of Saul. St. Paul was Epaphroditus. And Epaphroditus was also the guy who killed Nero, wheels within wheels. Now, after all of this happened, Rome didn't want you to know anything about this. Rome didn't want you to know that you could revolt against Rome. They had to cover this up. They didn't want you to know anything about this Jesus character, this Manu Emmanuel character. And so when they were writing the gospel story, and the gospel story, I think, was written by Josephus Flavius, or at the very least, he was the editor of these books. Because if you read Luke and Acts have extracts from the works of Josephus Flavius all the way through them. This is why when you read the Gospels, they say that the Gospels were written in the AD 70s. And so there was 40 years of oral transmission between, the traditional gospel story, which happened in the AD 20s and AD 30, and when the books were written, the gospels were written in the AD 70s. And there was this 40-year gap of oral transmission. Why? The Jews were highly literate. You've only got to read the works of Josephus to know that they were highly literate. Why would they have 40 years of oral transmission trying to make these people look like pauper carpenters again, instead of, proper kings and aristocrats? They say this because there is this 40-year gap, and the books were certainly written in the AD 70s because they contain so much material from Josephus Flavius. And Josephus Flavius did not write his books until AD 72. So the Gospels have to be written after AD 72. And so they have to make up this story of this missing 40 years. In reality, of course, the Gospel events actually happened in the AD 70s, well, AD 60s and AD 70. The crucifixion was in AD 70. And so the books were actually written, the Gospels were actually written immediately after the events that they describe. But the events they describe were the Jewish revolt. And remember that Josephus Flavius gives us a story of the crucifixion. So if you read Josephus's life, which is his autobiography, he gives his history as the army commander in command of Galilee. And remember, in Galilee, he was chasing this guy called Jesus across Galilee because Josephus Flavius was working for the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem. And the Jesus character, Jesus of Gamala, was the rebel. And so he was fighting this rebel called Jesus in Galilee in the AD 60s. But then the Jewish revolt started, and Josephus changes sides. Just like Saul, he has a flash of inspiration on the road to Damascus, and he changes sides. And now he starts working for the Romans. So he becomes the Roman propaganda minister, basically, fighting against the Jews, fighting against the Jesus of Gamala character again. So anyway, he's working for the Romans, and after the Jewish revolt ends, he is with a detachment of Romans. Remember, he's now a Roman army commander. So he's with a detachment of Roman soldiers, and they go down to Tekoa, which is Herodium, just south of Jerusalem, to see if that can be used as a fortress, because it was a fortress of the Jews. He comes back from Tekoa, and he sees the leaders, the three leaders of the Jewish revolt, being crucified in the Kidron Valley outside the gates of Jerusalem. He recognized them as being his former compatriots, because remember, he's changed sides. He's now working for the Romans. So he goes to the Roman governor and asks for them to be taken down early. They're taken down early. Two of them die, and one of them survives. Familiar story? Yeah, this is the crucifixion of the Jesus character, because remember, the Jesus character was the king of Edessa who led the Jewish revolt, who had just lost the Jewish revolt against Rome, and now was being summarily crucified in the Kidron Valley by the Romans. But Josephus not only recognized these people as being his former compatriots, but he saw the stupidity of this. You can't have a hostage who is dead. You have to have a living hostage. So he immediately runs to the governor, who happens to be Titus at the time, and says, look, take these people down from the cross. This is stupid. So they're taken down from the cross, and one of them survives. Guess who that was? That was the Jesus character, the king of Edessa. So he survived. This is the crucifixion story. But of course, when it came to writing this story in terms of the Gospels, the last thing that Rome wanted you to know is that this Jesus character was fighting a revolt against Rome. You were not allowed to revolt against Rome. Rome had had enough problems with the Druids in Britain, which had only just happened a decade before. It was about AD 62, if I remember correctly, where Rome had to go and wipe out all the Druids in Britain because they had rebelled against Rome. And that caused a huge uprising with the Iceni uprising in Britain, which had resulted in 6 Roman cities being destroyed. So they had an inkling here that being too heavy-handed could result in another revolt if you're not careful. The Druids and the Iceni had already proven that just less than 10 years before. And so I think they went the opposite way in this. We're going to use propaganda instead. And so they had this propaganda effort in order to neuter Messianic Judaism, because it wasn't all the Jews who were rebelling, remember. This was the Messianic Jews, the Church of Jesus and James, who were against all Roman occupation of Judea. They did not want to work within the Roman Empire whatsoever. And so they had to quell the Messianic Jews.
Yeah.
Well, how do you do that? Well, either you wipe them out, of course, which they had already tried with the Druids, and that didn't work. Or you give them an alternative Judaism, a Rome-friendly form of Judaism. Well, they already had one of those. That had been formulated by Saul, Josephus Flavius, and he'd already been promoting that around Europe on his second evangelical tour. His first evangelical tour, he had been working for the Nazarene, of course, for the Church of Jesus and James. And he wasn't very successful. He got beaten on several occasions. So on the second occasion was after the Council of Jerusalem, when he had already been given these 4 rules of simple Judaism that we talked about, when he had already become the apostle to the Gentiles, and he went around Europe evangelizing for his new simple Judaism, which we call Christianity. This was a Rome-friendly form of Christianity. Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Turn the other cheek. Your rulers and governors of Rome are appointed by God, so you must obey them. Oh, this was just perfect, wasn't it? This was exactly what Rome wanted, a Rome-friendly form of Judaism. And so that's what Rome wanted to promote in order to neuter Messianic Judaism. So all of the oppression that occurred after the Jewish revolt was against the Messianic, the Nazarene Jews, the Ebionites. They were the ones being oppressed. But the church of Saul, simple Judaism, was not only being given a free ride, it was being promoted by Rome as a Rome-friendly alternative to Messianic Judaism. That's what Rome wanted. That's what Rome crafted when it made the gospel story, because the gospel story is now Rome-friendly. This was nothing to do with the Romans. The Romans weren't doing this. The Romans weren't persecuting this Jesus character. It was the horrid Jews. They were doing that. The leader of this revolt suddenly became a pauper prince of peace. So instead of being a warrior monarch, although incongruously he's still called a king within the gospel story, but now he's a pauper prince of peace, not a real king. He's only a pretend king. And they call him a carpenter. But of course, he's not a carpenter at all. He's called a tekton. And a tekton in the Greek is an architect. And not simply an operative architect, he's a speculative architect. He is a Freemason. So Jesus was the Grand Master of the Judean Lodge. He was a Freemason. And of course, Freemasonry did exist in this time, because Freemasonry is all about the building of the Temple of Solomon. And the raising of Lazarus within the Gospel of John is a third-degree raising. It's exactly the same as you would go through. It's the same as I went through when I became a Master Mason. It's exactly the same. The raising of Lazarus is a third-degree Masonic raising.
Wow.
And so Jesus was a Freemason, and he was a monarch, he was a prince. That is why he was anointed by Mary Magdalene at the house of Simon. Now, this is always sort of glossed over, I think, within Christianity. Oh, he was just anointed because she liked him, so she anointed him. No, the anointing of a prince is how you make a king. He becomes the anointed king. He becomes the Christ. Christ is not some strange spiritual term. Christ means the anointed king. Messiah means the anointed king of Judea. Exactly the same as King Charles, just a few weeks ago, was anointed in Westminster Abbey. I don't know if you saw that, but they covered it all up. They put a screen around him while he was anointed. He was only in, so he had taken his clothes off and he just had a smock on. And they put a screen around him, and he was anointed with oil by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So at that time, King Charles became Christ Charles. He became the Christ. He became the anointed king. He became the Messiah. He is effectively the Messiah of Britain. He is the anointed one. That's what Mary Magdalene was doing to Jesus. This is why we know that Mary Magdalene was very important, because the only person who can anoint a king is the chief priest or the chief priestess. So Mary Magdalene was a chief priestess who anointed Jesus as King of the Jews. That's why he was known as the King of the Jews. This all happened at the house of Simon. Well, that's interesting, because we know from the Talmud that Mary Magdalene was probably Mary Boethus. I think this was first suggested by Professor Robert Eisenman, who said that Mary Boethus has to be Mary Magdalene because they both lived at the house of Simon. So Mary Boethus was the daughter of Simon Boethus. And the reason why this is not spoken of very much is because Mary Boethus was the richest woman in Judea. So when she married Jesus, because she married Jesus, of course, this is according to the Talmud, she was given a dowry of 1 million gold denarii. Now, in modern terms, that's worth about 20 billion. So she was hugely rich, and that was just her dowry. That wasn't the wealth of the family. That was just her dowry. She was the richest woman in Judea. This is the woman who had never walked on the ground. She had only ever walked on carpets. So she had a red carpet rolled out for her wherever she went. This was a marriage between a prince, Prince Jesus, and the richest woman in Judea.
Not a carpenter and a working woman.
Not a carpenter and a prostitute. Although she could have been a prostitute because Mary probably was a virgin, but she was probably a Vestal virgin. We get that from the Proto-Evangelium of James, which says that she was a Vestal virgin in the temple when she was younger. So, yes, of course she was a virgin, but that doesn't preclude you from leaving the temple and then marrying and having lots of children, which she did. So both Marys were probably Vestal virgins. But then she married, and she married very well. She probably married her brother. It's likely that Mary Magdalene and Jesus were half brother and sister, which again was common. This is what people did. Abraham, from the Old Testament, he married his half sister. King Agrippa II married his sister Berenike.
So again, is that the same, like the same Simon that so what I was talking to you about before, the same Simon potentially?
Potentially, yes, because we don't know. We were talking about Gamaliel and that
Yeah.
side of the story, which is
Yeah.
very difficult to fit in because there's not enough information to say who he is. He's
Mhm.
obviously very well connected to this same family. Gamaliel was one of the sages and teachers of this group. He was the sage within the Jewish Sanhedrin, their government, who defended the disciples because they wanted the government wanted them locked up for teachings that were incompatible with Judaism. It was Gamaliel who defended them and said, "No, let them go." He was obviously closely connected to this Nazarene sect, and he was obviously closely connected to this royal family. Not easy to discern exactly who all of these people were. Like it's not easy to say who John the Baptist was. We said earlier that he has to be connected with this royal family because it was the Edessans who came down and punished the Judean tetrarch for his death. So he must have been connected with Edessa. He must have been connected with this royal family. But for the life of me, I cannot find John the Baptist within this royal family. But he must be there somewhere. So there's a few characters that we can't identify because we don't have enough information.
You direct people to research and look if they've watched this episode and they're wanting to do some further investigation.
Well, obviously, read my books first of all, because they will give you all of the reference. So we can't reference things here because we just simply don't have enough time. But all my books are fully referenced, and all of my books come from original sources. So I don't quote other authors. I've never done that. In fact, I don't read their books quite often. So I don't want to be influenced by what other people are saying. I just go direct to the original sources, direct to the Gospels, to Josephus, to the apocryphal Gospels, the Talmud, which is interesting. The Talmud has a lot of information in there. So everything comes from those. And all I'm doing is reinterpreting this because the story remains the same. If you read the Gospel story, that story is exactly the same as my historical Gospel story. The only difference is that the timeline has changed and some of the people are slightly more powerful than you might expect. They're suddenly kings and princes. They're not pauper princes of peace. But then who do we write stories about? We write stories about important people, powerful people. strategic events that have happened throughout history. That's what we write about.
Yeah,
And that's
that's right.
what this story is about. It's about kings and queens and the Jewish revolt against Rome. Everything is fully referenced. So the books you want to read are Cleopatra to Christ,
Mm-hmm.
King Jesus. So Cleopatra to Christ obviously is connecting this story back up to the reign of Cleopatra. King Jesus is a comparison um, with Jesus must be a monarch, but I didn't know what monarch at the time, and all the comparisons with the Talmud,
Mm-hmm.
just trying to prove that this was a very important royal character. And then Jesus, King of Edessa, when I actually have found this place called Edessa and I started writing about Edessa, because until that time I didn't know anything about Edessa. Then we've got the Grail Cipher, which is my re-evaluation of Arthurian legend, because this is connected to it, because the primary hero of Arthurian legend is Joseph of Arimathea, who is obviously a first century gospel character. So that's interesting. And just as a sample of how this is connected, the guy who took the leaders of the Jewish revolt down from the cross was
Yeah.
called Josephus Flavius, yeah? And his name was Josephus Bar Matthias.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph Arimatheus? It seems likely from this and from Arthurian legend and from many other reasons that Josephus Flavius also gets a starring role in the Gospels and within Arthurian legend as Joseph of Arimathea. Because, I mean, who is this guy? He sort of just appears at the
Mm.
end of the Gospels, and you're supposed to know who he is, but nobody does. He just appears for no good reason, a bit like sort of Richard I coming back from the Crusades within the Robin Hood story, and he just appears at the end of the story, just as it's all coming to a climax.
Mm.
Joseph of Arimathea does the same, and yet it doesn't explain who this guy was. Well, he was Josephus Flavius. But of course, they cannot admit that because Josephus Flavius was an AD 60s character, not an AD 30s character. So they can't admit that the guy who took Jesus down from the cross was Josephus Flavius. But of course, we know from his own autobiography that is what he did. He took the leaders of the Jewish revolt down from the cross. So Josephus Flavius was Joseph of Arimathea. And he is the main character, one of the hero characters within Arthurian legend. And there is a problem here, which is why I wrote this book on Arthurian legend. It's a big, long 600-page book on Arthurian legend, reinterpreting Arthurian legend. The problem is that some of these original manuscripts of Arthurian legend say that the original author of Arthurian legend was Josephus Flavius. That's a problem. And we'll go into that perhaps on another talk, because I think
Wow.
we will need to separate that out into another talk. So yeah, that the guy who wrote Arthurian legend was Josephus Flavius, according to the original manuscripts. That's what they say, and we'll go through that later. So all of these books are available on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
Do look for the ones that are 2017 or later editions. You'll find some that are very expensive, and I don't know where they've come from. There are some different books knocking around. All my books should be 2017 or later editions, because I updated all the editions um, with extra photos. There's a lot more photos. There's a lot of updates to the text.
That's really good.
Yeah, so they're much better editions, 2017 or later, and they are part of a series. So when you look it up on Amazon, it should say part of the King Jesus Gospel series or something. Oh no, the King Jesus trilogy. So it's a
Beautiful.
trilogy in 4 parts now, because there's another book added on to the end. So yeah, do look up those books. They're all interesting. My Facebook site is very active, got a lot of information on there, which is ralph.ellis.144 on Facebook, and it'll pop up there if you do a search. A lot of interesting information that we've not discussed here, because I'm going to have to write this more formally, I think, and go through this. But I found a lot of information on the Edessan church in India. I've written all of these books about Edessa, and I didn't know anything about Malabar until a year ago, when suddenly I started finding all of this stuff. So this is the History of the Church of Malabar, which is the Edessan church in India that was founded by Thomas Didymus. Well, his full name is Judas Thomas Didymus Lebbaeus Thaddeus, and he was the twin brother of Jesus, because Jesus had a twin brother. That's what Thomas means. Thomas Didymus means twin. Jesus had a twin brother who was Judas Thomas Didymus, and he went to India. He was sent out to India. This is why you get all of these rumors and stories about Jesus going to India. I don't think he did. I think it was his twin brother. It was
That's
Judas
very
Thomas Didymus,
interesting.
who was also called Addai. So it's a part of the doctrine of Addai story. But he went from there, he went to India as well. Judas Thomas, came from Edessa. Now, he went from Edessa to India, to Malabar, and set up a church there. But in the 3rd century, his bones were sent back to Edessa, where they were still, they're not there now, of course, since Islam took over the place, but they were there for many years. That's why the ambassador of Alfred the Great went to Edessa and then to Malabar, because it was following the route of Thomas, the brother of Jesus. If the twin brother of Jesus came from Edessa, then where did Jesus come from? I think he came from Edessa. So this book, the one I've just shown you, this one here. This is from the history of the Church of Malabar from the time of its being discovered by the Portuguese in 1501. And this book was written in 1694. So people have known about this history for many centuries. They were writing about this in the 17th century, based on the Portuguese expedition to India in 1501. So all of these connections back to Edessa were known in the 17th century, but they've all sort of been covered up. Nobody seems to want to talk about Edessa. We have a lack of information.
If they start speaking truth now, it really does unravel a lot of things, doesn't it?
Yeah, it changes the story somewhat if
Yeah.
Jesus came from Edessa, because once you know that and you start looking up the history of Edessa, you suddenly find that there is a parallel story in Edessa all about the Jewish revolt. Sorry about the tail, this tail suddenly arrived. A parallel story that mimics the gospel story very closely. And then you might start asking, oh, well, who were the kings and queens of Edessa at this time in the 1st century? And then the whole of the Christian version of the New Testament starts to unravel.
Yes.
Now, it's the same story. The story doesn't change. That's the interesting thing about this. All of the New Testament events happened. It's just they didn't happen in quite the way you imagine them. This was a story about powerful princes and kings, and it was all to do with the Jewish revolt. But the Romans covered this up because the last thing they wanted you to know, as I've said before, is that you could revolt against Rome. And so they turned this powerful warrior king into a pauper prince of peace who was very favorable towards Rome. He wasn't fighting against Rome. He loved Rome, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. And so the story has been changed because the story we have now is Roman propaganda.
Yes.
So all of these Christians around the world are still believing in this Roman propaganda story, which was peculiar to Vespasian and Titus and Domitian of the 70s and 80s AD. That's what they wanted in order to maintain the Pax Romana within Rome, the Roman peace. People today are taught that Rome was an oppressive warrior society, terrible society. We don't like to be like the Romans. It wasn't. It was peaceful. They had the Pax Romana. As long as you understood that you venerated Rome first, and then you venerated your particular deity second or third, but you had to be Roman first. And then you had the Pax Romana. You had the Roman peace. Because around central Rome, the main parts of the empire, in France, even in Britain, most of the places all the way up until you get to the borders of Rome, the towns and cities had no wall. They were not walled cities because They had the Pax Romana. Why bother building a wall when you've not had any military disputes for a couple of hundred years or more? There was no point. You didn't have walls around your cities, and that was a problem later when Islam started moving across. A lot of these cities were unwalled; they were undefended, and so this is what Rome wanted to promote. And if they could not do it through military means, like they did with the Druids, then they would do it through propaganda. And they would create, if they had a religion that was anti-Rome, well, we'll turn it into a religion that's very similar and is pro-Roman. And we call that Christianity. It was the propaganda story created by Rome, and people still believe in it.
I think that's going to blow some people's minds.
Yeah, that they're believing in propaganda. This is
Absolutely.
how effective propaganda can be. Um, this is why I'm sort of worried and start getting vocal about the current sort of woke propaganda that we're getting, because many people will just believe in it without actually investigating it further, and we might get a sudden change in our society again based on pure propaganda, because that's how the world works. It can be very successful.
Wow. Whenever I watch your videos or talk to you, my brain just feels like a sponge, and then by the end of it, I'm just like, oh my goodness, like I need to take a break. I need to have a coffee.
Yes.
I'm going to spend like the next week going down rabbit holes in depth,
Yes,
studying
there are
this.
many holes to go down. But the advantage of this story is that people have investigated this story many times before, of course, but their rationale and their explanations does not always make sense. The beauty of this is all of this makes sense. So this is a vast crossword puzzle. No, not a crossword puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle, where we have all of these little pieces throughout the New Testament and Old Testament and throughout classical history. And you start putting them together, and they all fit together perfectly. Like I was explaining with the Saul equals Josephus story, it starts becoming explanatory. It explains things that we didn't know before. And all of these pieces fit together perfect, and they make a cohesive picture. And that picture makes sense. It all hangs together as one very nice picture.
Thank you for bringing that picture to us so that we can see and understand a little bit more truth that's been obviously suppressed for far too long.
Yes, it has. And of course, it doesn't really even affect people like Christians. You can still be a Christian if you want to hang a religious aspect on top of this. I mean, I don't do religion, but if you want to hang a religious aspect on top of this, a spiritual side to this, you can do that if you want. But
Mm.
just understand that your hero character was a king, a real king, and not a pauper prince of peace. And it's pretty much the same sort of story. You can say he was a freedom fighter. He was fighting against the Rome. I think he was wrong to do so myself, but there we go. But you can argue about that, whether he was right or wrong as a freedom fighter. I think Rome was doing more good than they were doing bad. And I think it was crazy to go and fight against them. But anyway, that's what he did from his point of view. Rome was on his lands, and he was a freedom fighter fighting for his lands. View it in that aspect, if you will. But it's the same story. If you want to put a religious aspect, icing sugar on the top of the cake, if you want to, it's the same story. It doesn't change the story very much. I've got some critics who say, "Oh, Ralph is saying that King Arthur lived for 600 years." No, I'm not. I really think some of these critics are brain dead. All I'm saying is the story has been retold in a different era. So they've relocated this story into the 6th century. It's just like West Side Story, where they relocated Romeo and Juliet into New York somewhere. Now,
Mm.
that doesn't mean that Romeo and Juliet lived for 400 years. It just means the story has been relocated. I think people in the Middle Ages connected with the Knights Templar knew about this story, and they wrote about this story. But after the Templars were destroyed on Friday the 13th, 1307, which is why Friday the 13th is still unlucky for some, this story got lost again because it was heretical. It was very difficult to maintain. And the only way it was maintained was by people keeping on talking about the Arthurian story. But the trouble is they lost the meaning behind the Arthurian story. They forgot what it was based upon. And so most of this has been lost from history. Nobody knows about it anymore. So this is a venerable old story that many people in the past have known about. And I'm sure as we start discovering more and more information, more facts about this will come out. The Hakok mosaic came out. I think we should discuss that later, perhaps when we come on to King Arthur. We'll discuss that later. But the Hakok mosaic was discovered 4 or 5 years after my book was written. Yet the person on the front cover of my book is the Hakok mosaic. It's the same character. I predicted the discovery of this mosaic in Israel. Yeah, 5 years before it was discovered. It's the same person. You can see the similarity. Just have a look at the front of my book and have a look at the Hakok, the Alexander mosaic, as they call it. That's an interesting story, so we must go through that later. But yeah, that's how predictive my investigations and my books are. They are predicting what will be found in digs all across Israel. So interesting stuff.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you so much for spending time with us today and teaching us. We are very grateful for your vast wisdoms that I think probably go over a lot of our heads, but we'll try to understand as much as we can.
Pleasure. Great to be with you again, and looking forward to the next one.